to the first episode of the Normal Men podcast. My name is George, and I'm joined by my friend Propter.
Hi, guys. I'm Propter.
Before we launch into the subjects we're going to talk about on our first episode, we wanted to give y'all a bit of a roadmap as to what the heck this podcast is about. Why are we here? So I think it helps to start out by being very transparent about the fact that we are all kind of similar. All four of us that are going to be on this podcast are similar. We all share a very similar politics. We are left or liberal leaning people. You are not going to hear a bunch of shocking or aggressive or politically extreme content, but it's definitely going to have a very specific orientation.
Yeah, I think that, in the political situation that we find ourselves right now, there's this absolute deluge of news that is just crashing into us every day. And one of our goals with this podcast is to help try to kind of contextualize the news, riff on it a little bit, and maybe give you some perspectives that you wouldn't necessarily have had before, some thoughts about the news that you wouldn't have had before. And as we do that, because we're human beings, we're a bunch of white men of a certain age spread around the country. We're going to talk about some other things that are interesting to us. We're going to talk some about our vision of masculinity, what it means to be a man. We're going to talk about law. We're going to talk about economics. We're going to talk about maybe entertainment if we get there. We're going to talk about finance. And we think we've assembled a crew here that has a set of perspectives and a set of expertise that will maybe be valuable in contextualizing some of this fire hose of news. So what we're going to do every week is we're going to take 2, 3, 4 of what we think are the most important stories and maybe the most misunderstood stories from the last week. And we're going to talk through what we think about them and some things that you might want to consider thinking about with regard to them.
Yeah. And it's important to say, just because our demographics, we're all middle-aged dudes, just because of our education or specific domain expertise, or just because of where we live, we all live in second or third tier cities around the country. None of us live in New York or LA or Chicago. And just because we are very committed to posting a lot, we're all very online, but also all very engaged in the local community out in the real world around us. Just because of that mix of perspectives and biases, creating a given viewpoint, it doesn't mean it's the right viewpoint. It's just our viewpoint. So hopefully folks find that interesting, and hopefully folks learn something, both in terms of positive information like facts, and hopefully folks come away thinking a little bit different about the world. We're not here to shock you or challenge you in any kind of jarring way. We're just here to sort of share some takes and hopefully have a lot of fun doing so. So I'm really excited for this project. I think it's going to be a really fun canvas to paint on. And Propter, thanks for coming along with me to join this on this journey.
I'm super excited about this. We're bumbling through this world of news and facts the same way everybody else is. And sometimes it's helpful to kind of talk out what you think and what you feel about what's going on to solidify and expand your opinions and understanding of it. George touched on something about kind of the dichotomy between being online and touching grass right now in this world that I think is important to all of us, which is that we think it's important to be rooted in both. That increasingly, online is where a lot of the action happens, but offline is where we live our lives. And it's important that there be some kind of correspondence, some kind of back and forth between the two. And one of our hopes here is to help try to kind of weave that correspondence both for ourselves and for our listeners.
Yeah, it's a very deep vein to mine because the human experience has shifted into phones and digital information to such a huge degree. But I think if you look at the people that are most happy, most satisfied, most rewarded by life, what they tend to have are very strong and deep networks of connection with people that have nothing to do with a smartphone or a laptop screen. And I think we are all guilty of sometimes scrolling our feeds instead of focusing on what's going on around us, whether that's our families or our loved ones or our friends. And we're all going to make those mistakes. But, at least we're aware that that's a mistake. And at least we're aware that these devices we carry around are changing how we think and how we behave. And, in the meantime, we have this absolute fire hose of new information about the world right now. Since the inauguration in January, every day has had a tide of mostly bad, but always interesting and necessary to consider stories. And, figuring out a way to come and share our thoughts on those and share our thinking on those as we sort of digest them with people in a way that isn't short form video content. It isn't a quick post. It's hopefully thoughtful conversation between people who may not always agree, but will always work to sort of have a good conversation about something. Hopefully that's something that you'll get value out of.
We titled the podcast Normal Men. And that's something of an aspirational goal as much as it is anything else. We think that we're all normal in some respects, but it's a fragmented culture now. There's not really a monoculture anymore. There's a bunch of different normals. In one sense, we're all, I think, fairly stable guys who live, from some perspective, pretty normal lives. And in another sense, we're all niche posters on a microblogging website called Blue Sky that didn't exist 3 years ago. So when we say normal men, that's both a goal that we're trying to reach for ourselves, and also maybe kind of an ideal that we're trying to hold out as something that it's possible to be.
So with that, I think we're going to jump into our conversation today. We're going to talk about tariffs. We're going to talk about the mass marches demonstrating against the president over the past weekend. And we're going to talk about the deportation case of Kilmar Garcia. And hopefully you will get something out of that conversation, and you'll tune in again in coming weeks as we roll out new episodes. Thanks very much and enjoy. Here are our other two members of the podcast.
Guys, can you introduce yourself? Here's Lowtax.
So I am Lowtax Speedrun Enjoyer. You've probably either seen me on Blue Sky or found somebody tagging me on Blue Sky over whatever nonsense Elon Musk has done today.
And we'll be referring to Lowtax Speedrun Enjoyer as Lowtax for short. We have
Yes.
We have a cumulative verbiage problem.
I am not Lowtax from beyond the grave.
And if you actually know who the real Lowtax is, you are just as online as we are. Congratulations for your poison brain.
That's right.
Our fourth member of the cohort today, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hey there, I am GOLIKEHELLMACHINE. I run my blog where I kind of talk to people about work. For work is 4 letters. I talk to federal workers for Doge is 4 letters. And throughout the course of this, I think you're going to just refer to me as Hell Machine, because saying my entire long name is ridiculous.
So
And
with introductions, go ahead.
I'm Propter Malone. I'll be going by Propter for purposes of this podcast.
So with introductions done, the thing we're going to talk about today is tariffs. Last week, Donald Trump announced a very large increase in the tax that the United States applies to goods coming into our country from the rest of the world. And that's had some repercussions. So
George, I had a couple questions about that. One of the things we're going to do on this podcast is we have people from a few different walks of life and areas of expertise. And so we're going to try to use our experts when we've got them. And George has some particular expertise in matters of trade and economics. When you apply a tariff, when you slap a tax on goods that are coming into the country, who actually pays that tax?
So the short answer is both the buyer and the seller. And the long answer is it depends on the respective elasticity of demand and supply. Don't worry about that second part because it's not worth thinking about right now. The first part is the way to think about it. Whenever you apply a tax to a good, a service, any transaction, the buyer and the seller are both going to be worse off because the revenue to the seller is going to go down. There's going to be less quantity sold, and it's going to be at a lower price after the tax is applied. And the buyer is also going to be worse off because they're going to pay more for the same thing and therefore demand less of it. Again, the specifics of how much goes each way are going to vary. But from the perspective of tariffs, what we can say is that a large percentage of whatever dollar amount or percentage amount we slap onto a good imported from any other country is going to pass through to consumers in the US. They're going to be the ones that pay a large chunk of whatever that tax is. In the case of very large tariffs, which in the case of some countries we're getting, Vietnam is one good example. The tariff may be so large that transactions simply don't happen. The Trump administration appears to have designed, for instance, tariffs against Vietnam, China, a few other countries, to be that prohibitively high, where you're talking about doubling the cost of a good imported from that country, and that's going to have a huge impact on how much actually gets brought in.
So, as a total novice on this who doesn't know anything at all, is there any particular reason that the tariffs are being applied to those countries in particular at the rates they are being applied?
That is a very good question. So the way the Trump administration has assigned these tariffs, as I said, every country, with the exception of Mexico and Canada, but every country has to pay 10% across the board. A couple of specific countries, some specific countries are going to have to pay more. And the more is because they have what's called a trade surplus relative to the United States. They sell us more stuff than we sell them, more goods. We're not talking about services here. So, for instance, Apple's cloud revenue from those countries isn't included in this. This is just goods delivered through ports or airlines or whatever. The amount of the tariff is set to the trade balance, the difference between the two, divided by how many imports come to the U.S. from those countries, divided by 2. So, for instance, if another country sends us 50 billion worth of goods and we send them 25 billion worth of goods, then 25 is the difference. That divided by 50 is 50%. Divided by 2 again, that's 25%. And that's the tariff that you would apply. Why did they set these tariffs in that weird formula? Good question. The operating assumption appears to be Donald Trump hates trade imbalances, and why he hates them isn't important. We're just going to tax them. Any trade imbalance, we're going to tax.
And it's possible that they have designed this by simply asking an AI how to eliminate a trade deficit, because it appears as though the major AIs, whether it's ChatGPT, whether it's Grok, whether it's Google Gemini, all appear to deliver this theoretical answer of half the whatever you said the equation was, the trade
balance
deficit
divided by imports divided by 2. Yep.
Right.
Yep. And the other thing is, when you look at the list of countries they announced them for, they happen to match up better with a list of top like domain codes, as opposed to like ISP domain codes, as opposed to any list of countries you would use normally for trade purposes. So, for instance, there are some otherwise uninhabited Antarctic islands that are included on this list that you would never actually use in a real trade negotiation with anyone because there's no one there. So
the penguins have been taking very strong advantage of us.
Yeah.
We're going to start winning again.
So I think one point that's kind of important to hit here is that Donald Trump talked a lot about tariffs on the campaign trail, and he's talked a lot about tariffs previously as something that he wanted to do as kind of this catch-all universal panacea that would solve all of our financial problems and all of our trade problems at once. But this particular structure of the tariffs was a big surprise to the market. This is not something either in terms of shape or in scope that the market was pricing in prior to last week, Wednesday, after market close when they announced. It's not clear that this was always the plan. It's not clear that these particular tariffs were the plan this morning, were the plan that Wednesday morning.
So George, let me ask: Is any of this normal? Because I think if you don't pay a whole lot of attention to kind of financial markets or stocks or anything like that, and I very definitely don't, it's hard to gauge from my perspective whether this is really unusual or this is normal or it's just completely bizarre or what the case is.
So let's unpack it into two different questions. Is this particular approach to changing trade relationships normal? And then is the market reaction normal? So on the question of trade relationships, no, this is completely unprecedented. There's never been anything like this, both for the outright stupidity of the way they've gone about it, for the scale that we're talking about here. I mean, if you take imports last year from all the different countries in question and you apply the different tariff rates, you work out to a sum that is about 2% of GDP. That is a big number for a new tax. That is a huge number. And as I mentioned earlier, that tax will mean less quantity gets imported, assuming it's around for any appreciable length of time. So um, it won't work out that we'll import the same amount last year and those numbers will be paid in the percentage that's applied. And there will be a decline in imports because prices are now higher for consumers. So you can do a bunch of estimates on that. Maybe something like a 20% decline in imports seems likely. So you can't just base what the tax is going to ultimately cost everyone based on that, like taking last year's and applying the percentage tax to it. And that's, economists call this elasticity. So the response to a price change. So there's that part of it. Normally what happens when you have two countries that are trying to negotiate over trade, you'll have a sit down where you go through line by line all the different trade restrictions, non-trade restrictions, everything like that. And you'll come to some sort of a package deal. This is what's called a free trade agreement, right? You'll lower tariffs that you each charge all countries, and you'll make specific arrangements around how dispute resolution will work and whatever. And they're very bespoke. They think of them as very bespoke, very unusual, very complicated contracts between countries. So that's what normally happens, as opposed to across the board, every country has a tariff rate applied to it, and come and talk to us is sort of how the Trump administration is spinning it.
And then I was going to say, Trump appears to be very much wedded to this idea that if you are running a trade deficit, as we are, you are being taken advantage of by these other countries. It's not simply that you want more of their stuff than they want of yours, or you can afford more of their stuff than they can afford of yours. It's this sort of dominance politics that always goes down with Trump. And so, George, can you go into a little bit on why that is not the case? Or if it is, why is it?
Yeah, so it's not the case because when other countries send us goods, we import from other countries. We are sending money to them, but we are getting something in return, right? When Vietnam sends us sneakers produced by Nike in that country, they get our dollars and we get their sneakers. That is a trade. It is, it's not something. Both parties are better off, right? So there are problems with trade where trade imbalances can create domestic dislocations in employment, or other structural issues. But the idea that any trade imbalance must mean that someone is getting that the country that's importing more than their trading partner is getting screwed is just it's like saying that any household's relationship with a grocery store means they're getting screwed because all the money is going from the household to the grocery store, and the grocery store's making all these profits and the household's getting nothing in return. Nonsense. The household's getting food. What are we talking about here? So that's like a really important understanding to start at. It when you're talking about trade imbalances creating domestic unemployment or creating problems in terms of currency differentials or whatever. There's a whole rabbit hole you can go down there. There are issues to talk about there, but they are much smaller than just, oh, there's a trade imbalance. The trade imbalance just represents them offering us a good deal for stuff we want.
And just to jump in on this, the goods that are being tariffed and that are being used for this calculation are only part of international trade. The United States runs trade deficits with almost everybody, not everybody, but almost everybody in goods. But we run surpluses in services trade. We do more in terms of services. We sell more services abroad than people abroad sell services to us. So if what you're doing as the Trump administration is you're trying to level target a zero trade deficit bilaterally with every country on goods, what that means is that you're definitionally going to have a trade surplus in terms of goods plus services because we have a trade surplus on services. Now, the aggregate trade surplus we have on services is a lot smaller. It's about a quarter the size of the aggregate trade deficit that we have on goods. So it's not. I don't mean to hold these things up as if they're exactly corresponding. But one of the things that is a major worry right now is that other countries will start to retaliate with tariffs against the United States, and a very obvious place for them to go is some kind of tax on services being sold from the United States overseas, where we're the surplus country.
Yep.
So, like, what would that mean, or what could that look like, just in terms of? Because I think it's easy to conceptualize this for goods, a little bit harder for services.
Short answer is a lot lower earnings for Google, Meta, Microsoft, our financial services companies, especially the banks. But I mean, much less international travel, airlines, for example. I mean, basically any service that you can imagine being sold overseas, whether it's consulting, whether it's financial services, whether it's, I mean, engineering, design, like you name it, right? There's so many different things that Americans sell overseas. So many different services that Americans sell overseas that would all, I mean, at least hypothetically be at risk. I think in general, to step back to, I had split up, is this normal into like the trade relationship question and the market question. The US stock market dropped about 10% in 2 days last week and on Thursday and Friday. So immediately after that, you can literally see a chart, S&P 500 futures start crashing as soon as the announcement comes out. There's a couple reasons for this. Reason number one is it's going to be really bad for the domestic American economy. Really, really tough because you've just increased the cost of a lot of stuff that sort of is, what's the word? It's like increasing the cost of putting gas in your car. Yeah, like gas in your car being more expensive doesn't mean necessarily that the bananas you buy at the grocery store are more expensive, but those bananas have to go on a truck at some point and you have to drive to the grocery store. And there's a whole bunch of very important economic activity, very high value economic activity that's dependent on imports being available and relatively cheap. And that economic activity is now imperiled. And so what you've seen, I mean, this is, like I said earlier, about a 2% of GDP tax that was announced overnight. That means less economic activity straightforwardly. Low tax.
Yeah, and it's not just, I think when people talk about goods coming into the country, and we've all talked about this on Blue Sky, and there have been articles about it in the papers. It's not just, going down to Best Buy and getting a television or a game system or something, right? It's not just buying a piece of furniture or something like that, or a shirt. There's also, these very complex supply chains. It's, there's a mine in North Carolina where they make, what is it, aluminum, I think, and then they ship it to Pittsburgh, where it's refined, and then that goes to Canada where it's further refined, and then to Mexico where it's turned into a piston, and then on to Detroit where it's assembled into a motor for an automobile. And so there's the complexity of our supply chains also is something to bear in mind here. Those are now being just broken.
Yeah. A normal world for us, the world that all four of us have lived in as adults, is one that is hideously complex from an economic perspective. It's relying on trillions of transactions by billions of people, with supply chains that you can trace back hundreds or thousands of steps back, with dozens of border crossings involved, that allow us to do the most complex and difficult things that human beings have ever done. Advanced semiconductors, any modern automobile, something like a Boeing plane or an Airbus plane, if you would rather use a slightly better safety record. There's just so much of what we do needs the concentrated and organized effort of millions of people scattered across the globe, doing everything from taking stuff out of the ground, growing stuff in the ground, processing, organizing, shipping, moving. Like I think the average person just has no idea how complex our material world is, and normalcy depends on that. It depends on that complexity. And without that complexity, and when you have shocks to that complexity, things start to get unnormal really quickly. And that's what we saw during COVID. So during COVID, there were breakdowns in supply for important goods because, well, we don't need to get too far into the weeds there as to why, but there was less supply of these goods. There was really strong demand, lots of income floating around. People had the checks that were handed out during the COVID pandemic as a way to keep incomes up. And there were these imbalances, and suddenly it was impossible to do stuff that before the pandemic was very easy to do. And the result was inflation. And that was a huge deal at the time, both in terms of people's standards of living, but also in terms of how they viewed the world. We are shocking that global system of material goods much harder with these tariffs than we were with the COVID supply demand imbalances.
And I want to jump in on that because I feel like when economists talk to the public, the word inflation kind of gets used in a different way necessarily than it's heard. You can talk about inflation from the perspective of it being a monetary phenomenon where there's more dollars chasing the same amount of goods and therefore prices go up. We're not going to see necessarily that form of inflation, but what we are going to see as a result of the tariffs is we are going to see a big change in price levels. There has been some amount of discussion on Twitter and on Blue Sky as to whether or not that's actually inflation. For purposes of you, the listener, it's inflation in the sense that the prices you pay are going to be higher.
Yeah.
Whether or not it's monetary inflation is not really the question you were asking.
Yep. It's important to keep in mind that the systems that we're talking about here that make sure that the goods and services you consume every day make it to where they're supposed to be cannot be replaced overnight by domestic production. That might have been true 200 years ago, but the complexity of what we achieve every day in terms of technology, in terms of health, in terms of energy distribution, I mean, there's a million different ways to talk about this, is so much higher that you can't just flip a switch. Building a factory in this country takes 3 years. I mean, that's arguably like a best case scenario. You have to find a site. You have to prepare that site. You need all the permits to do so. You need a connection to the utility. You need to buy the transformers necessary to bring in the power. You need to make sure that you have the local labor force available. You need to make sure that you have the logistics connections available. You need to make sure that you're planning the building up to code and making sure that it's not going to collapse on itself. You need to buy all the equipment that you're going to use to manufacture whatever you're manufacturing. You need to have agreements signed for people to buy that stuff, because once you start the factory up, you need customers. You're not going to build the factory until you have some idea that people will be buying it. You need capital to cover all of these expenses. This all just takes enormous amounts of time. And the result in the long run is that we have incredible levels of productivity, incredible levels of technological complexity. But getting that production from a treed lot to a running factory takes a long time. So these tariffs are not going to result in a wave of companies opening up large, factories to build Nintendo Switches in the United States. That will not happen. I don't care who tells you otherwise. They're lying to you. They don't know what they're talking about. No, that's not going to happen. If we had these tariffs in place for years into the future, guaranteed in place in law in a way that couldn't be flipped back and forth, if we had large scale bureaucracies dedicated to getting factories turned over and spun up, getting production started, if we had lots of planning around where supply chains were going to move from back into the United States, if we had huge amounts of capital from the federal government backing all this, then 2-3 years might be a decent estimate for when you could onshore much of what's being discussed as being onshore near term. We have none of that, and it is not going to happen overnight.
Yeah, I was laughing the other day. I think we all saw the somebody posted a tweet over on Twitter, asking if Switch production could be up and running in the United States in 2 to 3 months, and I'm here to tell you folks, there is just down the street from me a Publix. This, me being in Florida, there's of course always a Publix within 5 minutes. They just finished it last year. It took them 2 years to build that Publix. Now, how long do you think it is going to take to build a Switch factory? What year was the CHIPS Act passed? Was that 21 or 22?
Summer of 22.
Okay. And I believe we're only anticipating the TSMC plant in Phoenix, or just outside of Phoenix. I think they're only supposed to be running up to full production next year.
They're not at full production right now. They're doing production runs, but I think they'll be scaled up with their first plant. I think it's a 4 nanometer foundry. I think it'll be fully scaled by the end of this year. But I mean, this is exactly right. I mean, it takes time. It takes enormous amounts of time, and that's talking about one specific industry, right?
And that's with enormous federal government backing.
Yes. Enormous amounts of capital in terms of tax credits, enormous amounts of willingness and hard work from not just people at TSMC and in the federal government, but also the state and local governments involved. I mean, and this is for just one factory, right? We need hundreds and hundreds and hundreds like this to come anywhere close to replacing the sorts of value we import from the rest of the world.
I kind of wonder if the Switch 2 winds up being kind of like the Rudy Gobert moment with COVID.
Tapping the microphone and then
yes,
getting COVID 2 days later.
Shit moment.
I just wanted to jump in on the heels of that. TSMC is the Taiwanese company that manufactures semiconductors, and that is an industry that kind of speaks to global interconnectedness, because for whatever reason, and there are lots of reasons why this might be the case, but for whatever reason, most of a particular type of semiconductors in the world are made on the island of Taiwan and nowhere else. And efforts to get production of that up and running elsewhere have been less than fully successful. We don't think there are magical elves in Taiwan that are making the factory run. We don't think there's anything mystical about this.
We've looked.
Yeah. But I mean, we're kind of in the neighborhood where these are the things that they're exploring. And in fact, I think TSMC has been having some trouble getting things they thought would pencil out just fine in Arizona to operate the way they thought they would in Arizona. So
actually, that's not strictly true. Their yields have been very good, and in fact, for similar levels of chips, better than in Taiwan. Once they've gotten everything up and running, it's taken a little bit longer to get everything up and running. But which speaks to the fact that we can build stuff in this country very well. It's just most of it, what we would want to build, is not worth building because it's very low margin, cheap stuff. When we're talking about some of the most advanced semiconductors in the world, it's a very different thing from talking about injection plastic molding that you're making at 1 cent of revenue per unit or something like that. In the US, just is never going to pencil.
So, at the risk of sounding like an idiot here, assuming that the administration is serious about wanting to try to increase increase manufacturing in the United States, bring manufacturing jobs back to the United States, so forth and so on. Are they doing anything other than this to try to incentivize any kind of manufacturing production here?
Actually, the opposite. And the reason for that is, well, first, they're trying to roll back Inflation Reduction Act and CHIPS. These are two pieces of legislation passed under the Biden presidency. They're trying to roll back some of those provisions in just about any way they can. Those were two pieces of fiscal policy that were designed to incentivize more manufacturing here in the United States, among other things. And they have been broadly successful because they have done what we were talking about earlier. They've said, here's a bunch of money. Here's help making things easier to get this done. Here's knowing what you're going to have demand, because we're going to force people to buy from inside the United States, from inside North America. Here's a bunch of stuff. And the tariffs are not only, so they've raised the tariff wall, but they're also saying we're not going to do any of that. And oh, by the way, because this is happening as a unilateral thing inside the White House, like literally it's just one guy deciding to do this, there's enormous uncertainty around how big the tariffs will be and for how long they'll be around. The CHIPS Act and the IRA put into US code specific obligations of the federal government. The tariffs that were signed last week by executive order are being referred to as a negotiating tactic. Maybe they are, maybe they aren't, depending on who in the Trump administration you listen to. By the way, they're all saying different things on different days. They are much larger in terms of their impact on economic activity and in terms of the quote unquote tax rate than anything involved in CHIPS or IRA. And they have created uncertainty for demand, because if we have a recession, I don't care how much the tariff is, you're not going to expand your ability to produce something into an environment where demand from consumers is declining. So they are not just not doing the things you need to do when combined with tariffs to incentivize the fastest possible expansion of industries internally and manufacturing industries internally. They're actively undercutting any benefit you might get from the tariffs, leaving aside all the bad stuff that tariffs bring. So it's really, I mean, it is the single stupidest and most ill-conceived piece of economic policymaking we have ever seen in the world. I'm not exaggerating with that. There is stuff that was done throughout the communist bloc in the Cold War that made way more sense than this.
And just to jump in on for a second with a sense of scale, the tax hikes for Obamacare, which, as you may recall, were much bemoaned at the time, were about 0.5% of GDP in terms of revenue raised. The Trump administration is not going to get the revenue they say they're going to get out of these tariffs, but the amount of revenue they're shooting for is about 2.5% GDP. So these are
enormous numbers.
Yeah, these are on the order of about 5 times as big as the Obamacare tax increases that made everybody lose their mind.
So, we don't have to spend this entire episode on tariffs, but to close out, you'll see stock markets were down about 10% in the last 2 days of the last week. They're down heavily again. It's Sunday, April 6th when we're recording this. Futures were down 3% the last time I looked. Here's a piece of financial advice from someone who does financial stuff for a living. Do not try and speculate based on this stuff. You will get chopped up. I don't care how insightful you think you are. Just don't open up a Robinhood account to start taking options positions based on where markets go. It's going to be a mess this week. Stocks will be down big some days and head lower from here, but they're going to go up a lot along the way, because that's what happens when markets are stressed. They move around a lot in both directions. We'll probably have a U.S. recession this year. That's the base case at this point. That will mean lower interest rates, higher unemployment, weaker economic activity, lower income growth. You're going to be able to spend less. And oh, by the way, prices are going to go up because of these tariffs. This is really bad, man. It's bad. But I will say, please don't try and learn how to speculate against stocks in this kind of environment, because you will get destroyed. So with that,
we need to end the era of casino mentality, whether it's sports gambling or sites like Wall Street Bets and all this stuff. Up there on Wall Street in New York, in London, in Paris, in Tokyo, there be dragons, and you will get torched. So don't do that. Go put your money in a mutual fund or something and don't touch it for 30 years.
So you guys are saying that I shouldn't do sports gambling, and you're saying that I shouldn't try to gamble on the stock market. What kind of modern man can I even be?
The one thing to remember whenever you invest whenever you use options or take a flyer, it's the same thing as sports betting. It's you are making a bet that over time is guaranteed to lose, right? Like if you keep making that bet again and again and again and again, you're going to lose over the long term. And that is the exact opposite of just putting a little away every month in your 401k or in your IRA or whatever plan you have, and never looking at it. And in 30 years, it's going to be worth a heck of a lot more than it was today. You're almost guaranteed to win. So, and actually over a 30-year time span in total return terms, you are guaranteed to win, at least going back, 150 years or so. So, just keep that in mind whenever you're getting something marketed to you. All right.
So we had something else fun happen this weekend that was more fun than the ongoing meltdown of global markets, which is we had a lot of people in the streets for the hands-off protests. And
2.2 million. Was that the number I saw? 2.2?
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a bunch of different numbers that are wildly mutually contradictory. I think that the distributed nature of these protests and the fact that there weren't good numbers at a lot of these places means that estimates vary from about 2 million up to about 4 million.
Yeah, the estimates I saw were 3 million, but it's like I never trust these unless there's tickets being punched. You can just sort of go, there's a lot of people.
I also think you just run into problems trying to estimate this kind of thing. There were 1,700 different protests nationwide, and then trying to calculate how many people were at each protest is just, I think, gets into basically funny math. I can tell you that my experience here in Portland was really interesting and also kind of funny. In that the protest, and Portland is no stranger to protests. We are kind of known for these here, but it was very funny to get down to the waterfront right around the time it was supposed to start, so around 11 a.m. right, and you look around and people keep coming in until about noon, and everybody that is coming in is like my age or older, so I'm in my mid 40s, right? Everybody who is there early is my age or older. And so you have lots of signs about keeping hands off Medicaid, keeping hands off Medicare, keeping hands off Social Security, things like that. So I stick around for a couple of hours, and then I decide that it's just more people at that point that I'm really willing to be around at that time of day. And so I make my way out, and I make my way up to the bus stop. And as I'm making my way out, all of the young people are rolling in. So it was kind of funny to see, people all in their 20s who look like they all just rolled out of bed, are all coming in towards what was originally supposed to be the end of the protest here, right around the same time that people whose knees and backs hurt are making their way out.
So we do a hockey line change, and all of a sudden we've got the fresh horses out there. That's fantastic. I think one thing that all these images of these protests have really driven home for me is that this is a national phenomenon that is showing up in places that are extremely red, extremely blue. You're seeing old people come out for them. You're seeing young people come out for them. You're seeing Gen Xers come out for them.
There was one in Wyoming.
Yeah. I mean,
there's like 3 Democrats in Wyoming.
I mean, I was blown away by some of the images I was seeing coming out of the Mountain West generally, which is, I think, a particularly fertile area for this kind of protest, because the federal government has, in many ways, more of a role in particularly the rural West than it does in other parts of the country, because so much of the land management is federal. So much of the land is federal. So there are more kind of rubber hits the road jobs where people are going out and doing physical things very close to the community in a lot of these Mountain West states than there are elsewhere. I know the Pocatello, Idaho, which, unless you have a particular connection to Idaho, there's not a good reason you would know a lot about Pocatello. But they had what sounded like about 1% of the metro population, which is sort of the ante that all these places seem to be putting up out for this protest, and that's spectacular because Pocatello is not a blue bastion in a red state. Pocatello is pretty red.
One thing I definitely noticed is it seems like this skewed older than the electorate or older than who you would normally expect to be at protests. Certainly older than any of the protests I participated in 2020 after George Floyd and as part of the Black Lives Matter movement. They were not led by elderly people in terms of numbers. There certainly were some elderly folks that participated in those, but not the percentages we're talking about. I so many of the videos I saw, it's a lot of folks who are much older than I am, and I think that's really interesting because our politics has seen a shift away from the sort of extreme age polarization that characterized the 2010s and 2020s. And it really appears, these protests appear to be a sign of that older folks are much less interested in what's being sold by Republicans than they were 10 years ago. And younger, we've also seen the youngest end of the voter spectrum skew much more conservative than they used to.
I think that was interesting that I could see at the big protests in Portland. We had around 10,000 people and maybe more than that. It eventually got hard to count because it spilled over into the Old Town neighborhood and spilled across the entire Burnside Bridge to the point that it gets very hard to count the number of people who are there. But an interesting thing that I saw were the number of people with like assistive devices. So you had folks in wheelchairs, you had folks in walkers, you had folks with canes and with crutches, to a degree that I think non-Portland folks would maybe be a little bit surprised by if your entire understanding of how Portland goes comes from like the 2020 protests, right? Like you had entire families coming out. You had the NEA and just I remember watching a line of teachers walk by with their kids. It was actually real rad to watch, like multi-generation kind of families show up and kind of all kind of protests together. The one funny thing out here was that whomever it was rented a PA for like what you would get for a small dive bar to try to broadcast to over 10,000 people. So you couldn't hear a damn thing anybody said, but it kind of didn't matter, you know?
Yeah, I didn't participate in any of the protests just because the nature of my profession. I'd rather not get hatch acted or something. I can tell you that my mother down in South Florida, we had a pretty good turnout around where I live. But down in South Florida, there was a very strong turnout. My mother lives about 2 miles from Donald Trump's Jupiter Club, which is always a blast during the holidays when I'm trying to do last minute shopping and he's clogging up traffic and stuff as I'm trying to go to Publix or wherever. But there were thousands of people there, and it seemed to be to y'all's point. It did seem to skew. It was multi-generational. This being Palm Beach County, it of course skewed older. The median age was deceased, I think. But I was going to bring up that we talked about the declining age polarization, but do y'all think that there's a generational polarization coming on here. I know the four of us have talked in the past about how the Dems seem to be doing very well with in this past election with older folks and sort of the millennial demographic. So whereas with Gen X and the very young cohort of the Zoomers, they seem to be a lot weaker. Are we? Is the world of maybe the world of online discourse pushing us more into these sort of generational conflicts? Do y'all think?
One thing I'll say just before we get too far down this particular road is we need to be really cautious about reading into what the least reliable set of voters in the entire country, which is people under the age of about 25, are doing, both in terms of polling and in terms of actual turnout, like actual trends there. It's a truism that young people don't vote at anywhere near the rate that older people do, and that's basically always been the case. Modern political history, that's always been the case. So whether we think that younger folks, whether it's because of algorithm-based radicalization, the sort of horrible stuff that goes on in the manosphere, whatever, especially young men, this applies to, I think, whether or not they are the fascists that millennials are starting to paint them as, I want to just be really careful about drawing super strong conclusions from a very small and probably not representative group of people, which is voters who are under the age of 20 or under the age of 24, whatever, where you're already cut off. I think you can still have conversations about it, but let's not stray too far into drawing final conclusions there.
Yeah, that's fair.
Yeah, I mean, I think that one of the big things that emerged from the last election that we've already referenced here is that you saw the elder cohort move back blue in a significant way, and that I have a lot more confidence is durable than anything that's happening with the Zoomers. Like George said, I think we want to be careful not to overread things. I do think, though, that what Lowtax was gesturing towards, that some of this is maybe coming from age and microgeneration stratification within social media, that you have these smaller, tighter bands of age that are operating in concert with each other than maybe you used to. One thing that really popped in the data before the last election that I didn't really believe it at the time, but it seems like it kind of bore out, was that the younger half of the 18 to 29 cohort looked totally different than the older half of the 18 to 29 cohort in terms of how they were voting. I suspect if you drill down, the same is true for older cohorts to a greater or lesser extent. That I think one of the reasons why the gray hair cohort was moving blue was that it happened that the microgeneration that aged out of middle age and into the top age bracket cohort was, for whatever reason, significantly more blue than the rest of the Gen X cohort was. So I think that we are stratifying more in terms of age than we used to, and that could be something that could be interesting to dig into. And I'm sure that when we get the full voter data setback, we're going to have some fairly rigorous work done on that kind of thing.
Yeah, I think it's probably worth pointing out that we still don't actually have that data. So, like, anytime that someone is sort of making a blanket statement or an assumption, it's really just a guess based on what we know so far, and what we know so far is not the entire picture.
Yeah, definitely. And it's useful to use exit polling or whatever because it's the best data you have at the time. But always be revising your priors is a good way to approach the world. As a markets person, that's how you have to live. If you have a set of priors that are so hard that nothing can dislodge them, you are not going to be useful to yourself or anyone else. And I think that's it. Whenever you're talking about big social questions, especially ones where the data is not yet complete. You have to just let the data be what it's going to be and then take it from there. So I think with that, we can get to our last topic this week.
Okay, so we wanted to talk a little bit about Kilmar Ábrego García, who's a Salvadoran national who was deported on one of these 3 flights that went out that were mostly full of Venezuelans with a few Salvadorans to El Salvador, where we, the United States government, are paying for them to be incarcerated in CCOT, which is the gigantic supermax hell on earth prison that Bukele has built in El Salvador. And it's a case that I think we're going to be hearing a lot more about in days to come, in part because the government is taking a stance in this case that should send up red flags for everyone. But the facts of the case are as follows: that Garcia is a Salvadoran national who has lived in the United States for some time. I'm not sure when he got here, but he's had an order that prevents him from being deported to El Salvador since 2019. He's married to a U.S. citizen. He has a U.S. citizen child. He's also the main economic support for his wife's 2 children from a prior relationship. And the Trump administration has conceded that he was deported in error. They've said that this was a clerical error, a whoopsie doodle, a mistake, something that their legal position is that he should not have been deported. However, their legal position is also, now that he has been deported, they have no means and no responsibility to try to get him back. Regardless of what the court says, they say that he's out of U.S. jurisdiction now. He's in El Salvador. He's in CCOT, which again is this big nasty Salvadoran prison, and therefore the court might as well be talking to a wall. The court can go ask Bukele to give him back. Bukele has indicated that he's not inclined to do so.
Bukele is the president of El Salvador.
Bukele is the president of El Salvador, and we'll be hearing his name a lot, possibly in conjunction with war crimes charges at some point. But the United States government has essentially said that they can take anybody, and as long as they get them to El Salvador, the courts can't do anything to get them back. That is the
and anybody here includes U.S. citizens.
Anybody here includes U.S. citizens. Anybody here includes anybody. That once they're out of U.S. jurisdiction, once they're in Salvadoran hands, the position of the United States government is that no matter what the courts say, the United States government has no responsibility to go get them back.
The position is we have no rights.
Right. Now, as you might imagine, the courts have not been entirely happy with that statement, and this is now wending its way through litigation.
So just trying to kind of understand how this is going from a layman's standpoint, how far of a departure is this from previous administrations? Like how different is this from Biden, or how different is this from even Bill Clinton?
Oh, this is a dramatic departure. Now, this is the kind of thing that happens when you're deporting people. Sometimes you make a mistake. It doesn't seem like we ought to, but this is something that's happened under previous presidents, where somebody gets shipped off to somewhere they're not supposed to be. And we actually have a fairly well-worn path through the legal system for trying to get them back. You know, you go to their attorneys go to the judge. The judge says, okay, yeah, we think you messed up, government. And the government says, okay, we'll try to remedy this. In this case, the government is not saying we'll try to remedy this. In this case, the government is saying go piss up a rope. And that's a direction that seems kind of typical of how the Trump administration has approached the judicial branch interacting with its various immigration enforcement actions. But it's a real bad sign.
Well, it's basically trolling his policy, right? Like, essentially, you can't do anything to stop us from getting you onto the plane. And then once you get off the plane, there's nothing you can do to force us to put you back on it.
So I think that there are 2 ways to read this stance from the administration. this involves getting into maybe more background than we want to get into tonight. But these 3 flights that went out to Venezuela were, to my mind, very clearly put together in haste to try to get ahead of a completely different judge's orders not to do these flights. And that's the subject of litigation in a second court that is going not terribly well for the government. So one way to read the government's actions here is that this is all kind of something that got out of hand, something that they did because they thought they could jam it through before the courts acted, and then raise their hands and look innocent and say, "What do you want us to do? You didn't tell us not to do this. Now that you told us not to do this, of course we won't do it anymore. But it's already done. What can we do?" But because of some of the specific mistakes they made in terms of who they were putting on the plane, and there's an entire litany of mistakes that are not directly related to Kilmar Garcia, it may be that they're kind of backed into a position where they're sort of trying to backfill, defending things that they would not otherwise want to defend. That is, I think, the more charitable interpretation of the administration's actions. It's not particularly charitable.
Do we have a reading on either from stuff that some of our less normal Supreme Court justices might have said in dicta or something like that, or positions from conservative legal groups or anything like that? Do we have a sort of reading on where this is going to go at the Supreme Court, or what the conservative legal movement in general thinks about the idea that once you get a citizen or non-citizen to an El Salvadoran prison, there's nothing that can be done to bring them back?
I would say that I would be surprised. This is not something that's been advanced as one of these, longstanding bedrock cockamamie theories about what it is that the government can do. As I said, this is not what has been practiced in prior administrations, including under the first Trump administration. This is exceptionally lawless, and I think it's something that my guess is that even the Supreme Court will probably balk at. But we're going to kind of have to see how things progress through the appeals system. There's this case is currently now in front of the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals. My guess is that that'll be a favorable is that they'll get a favorable result for Garcia and an unfavorable result for the Trump administration. But I don't know that for sure. And then after that, it's something I could maybe see the Supreme Court doing something for them on the shadow docket, where they push it out without actually ruling on it. But I would be very surprised if the ultimate Supreme Court ruling is to say that, yes, this is a reasonable way to do things. That said, this is a Supreme Court that has done some very surprising things in the recent past.
To tie back into the conversation that we started with today with tariffs, it really does feel like the whole ball game here is just going as hard as you can and seeing what happens. And a lot of people in financial markets had been willing to give the Trump administration a lot of leeway around rhetoric, around actions to a point, but that's done. The stock market does not drop 10% in 2 days because people are excited about tax cuts. It's because the walls are being torn down and we have no idea what comes next. And it is really easy to see from that sort of price action the foundation of a massive material backlash against whatever the administration is doing. And I think this sort of overreach, such extreme overreach in the federal court system, in pleadings before federal judges, is sows the seeds of another kind of backlash. The opportunity for the Supreme Court to come in and look moderate or look politically reasonable is enormous, and to really smack down what the Trump administration is doing. Does that mean what they're going to do that? No, but it does. There is a political incentive structure there when this sort of stuff is put in front of even a complete pack of Looney Tunes to concentrate power for themselves. And I think when you combine that material side of financial markets and the potential here for the judicial courts or for the federal courts to really center power around themselves. I think we could be in very early, 3 months into this administration, we could be talking hitting a brick wall already.
Well, and along those lines, I felt like I saw a story the other day about a DOJ lawyer who was being disciplined for, referring to Donnie Darko, not having enough commitment to sparkle motion. And then it seemed like their supervisor also got disciplined for the same thing.
Yeah, that's actually in this case. That's the attorney on the Kilmar Garcia case who went in on Friday. This is Erez Ravini, who's a career DOJ attorney. He's been there for I think about 20 years now. And what I think got him suspended, put on administrative leave with pay. What I think got him suspended is that he told the judge, "Listen, I've asked for a legal justification from my client, the U.S. government, for what they're doing with Garcia. They haven't given me one. I don't know what to tell you." One of the issues that I think that the Trump administration is rapidly going to run into, and they're already running into it in a lot of places, is that they do not have an infinite number of lawyers to throw at these problems. And they are rapidly running through everybody who is not a political appointee.
Given how many lawyers we have in this country, that is a truly shocking thing to say. I'm married to one of them, and oh my God, they're in the walls. I mean, they're everywhere. It's unbelievable how many lawyers we have in this country.
Well, there's one on this call.
But remember, these are DOJ lawyers, right? And half of them probably been fired by Elon.
Yeah, I mean, it's definitely a problem that they're and this plays in other realms than just kind of the immigration lawfare realm, but it's a problem for this administration that they are slashing administrative capacity to the bone at the same time as they're trying to do these very, very big things in terms of executive power grabs. And again, to bring this back to the tariffs, one of the problems that I think they're going to have with the tariffs is actually levying the tariffs. It's actually enforcing the part where they collect money from people who bring goods into the United States. Even just the de minimis expansion, they're pulling back a rule where packages that were coming in from China, if they were under a certain declared value, just sailed through for a set rate. And they're changing that to where those packages are going to have to go through some version of customs. That's going to take a ridiculous amount of work. You think about every package that comes in through Temu, every package that comes in through Amazon from China. You've got a lot of these packages, and they just don't have enough people to process that. And I know that one concern that I've heard brooded about a lot is that that's going to further slow down commerce at the Pacific ports, and it's going to create a backlog.
Or maybe speed it up, but not in ways we would like.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, there's a well-established sector already doing logistics operations into the United States without interacting with customs, and they're not great people. These are the same people that we're maybe going to start shooting missiles at in northern Mexico.
MS-13, please get me a Nintendo Switch too.
The feeling of normalcy being just shredded, I think, has so much to do with the fact that we all grew up and came of age and have lived our adult lives in a world where the people that were in control did not behave like your lunatic neighbor who's trying to tear down your fence out of spite or something like that. We all come across people like this in our lives that sow chaos and try and break things, right? Every single person listening to this right now knows a person like that. they have never been in government before. We've had bad people in government before. We've had incompetent people in government before. We've had people that do things we don't like in government before. But we have never had a government dedicated to breaking stuff before. And it is really hard to see how you put that toothpaste back in the tube from here. It's going to take a lot of effort, and regaining a sense of normalcy has to involve not having people like that running our lives.
Yeah, we've never had your crazy Facebook uncle running the entire federal government. I mean, there's going to have to be, I think, consequences for a lot of people when these guys are gone. There's going to have to be a quite a grand apology tour by the next U.S. administration, and even that isn't going to solve it. This is the sort of destruction that is going to take decades to repair, if it can be repaired at all.
Lawful evil and chaotic evil are definitely both evil, but they are very different forms of evil.
And I think with that, we can wrap it up for tonight. Fellas, where can everyone find you?
Upside.
Where can everyone find you? I'm at peark.es on Blue Sky.
You can get me at Propter Malone, proptermalone.bsky.social.
You can get me at, you can either just search for Lowtax Speedrun Enjoyer, or you can get me at Ricky Williams Bong, RICKYWLMSBONG.bsky.social.
And you can find me wherever Go Like Hell Machine can be found.
All right. Y'all have a good week and be normal.
Until the next time, be normal.